Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be back in Seattle and back in Town Hall. I love this venue, and it's wonderful to see all of you. And special thanks to Town Hall Seattle for helping organize this, and especially to Elliott Bay Books for showing up. I know that I think our publisher kind of dropped the ball on some of the hardcover Crash of 2016s, but they have book plates that I can sign, and that way you can put a signed book plate in the book later if you'd like. So just, you know, get the business stuff out of the way, as it were. The message that I wanted to share with you tonight is a pretty simple and straightforward one, and I'm going to try and do it fairly briefly, and then we can do some Q&A. And that is that George Washington did not fight the Revolutionary War to free the East India Company or the billionaires in Europe. And that Abraham Lincoln did not fight the Civil War to free the corporations, the big railroad corporations and the land barons and whatnot. You know, most of us take this for granted. We think that, you know, this is the history that we know and understand, but the fact of the matter is that the Supreme Court over the last 30 years has asserted that both of those things that I just shared with you are not true. That George Washington actually did fight the Revolutionary War to protect the billionaires of Europe, and that Abraham Lincoln fought the Civil War to free the corporations. And, you know, I always thought he fought the Civil War to free the slaves, but apparently not, if you ask Judge Scalia. So, as a consequence of this, we are experiencing right now a genuine crisis of democracy in the United States. We have, you know, a very, very low voter turnout. And it turns out, you know, a lot of people, you ask them, why don't you show up to vote? And they say, well, because, you know, it's not going to matter. You know, sometimes they get a little sophisticated and, you know, well, it's, you know, both parties are bought off, or twiddledum and tweedledee, or whatever. But really, ultimately, at the bottom, at the end of the day, what they say is that, you know, I don't show up to vote because it's not going to matter, because it's the top 1%, or at the worst, the top 10% who get what they want legislatively. It's the special interest groups who get what they want legislatively. It's the big corporations who get what they want legislatively. It's not me. And now, just in the last month or so, what was his first name? I think it was Nathan Gillen. Yeah, I had him on the radio on Tuesday. I'm forgetting his first name. But anyhow, Dr. Gillen of Princeton University just came out with a study where they went back and they looked at over 20,000 pieces of legislation over a 20-some-odd year period, or 10,000 pieces of legislation over a 20-year period. And what they found was that, in fact, it's true that what the 50th percentile wanted, what average Americans wanted, what the 10th percentile wanted, what poor people wanted, didn't happen. I mean, you know, it would happen or not happen at a rate that roughly corresponded with random chance. Whereas what the top 10% wanted, or what special interests wanted, or what corporations wanted, happened consistently. This is not the definition of a democracy. A democracy should be, you know, there's these first three words in the Constitution, we the people. That is a democracy. That's how a democracy should work. And so, Martin Gillens is his name. In fact, yeah, I actually got a note about that. We've been here before. This is not the first time we've seen a crisis of democracy. The last time that this happened was at the end of the last Gilded Age. And we are now in the new Gilded Age, as you've probably heard many times. And the last Gilded Age was in the late 19th century, and you had the robber barons, and they basically controlled Congress. In fact, they bought members of the Senate. You know, the Senate was not directly elected. They were appointed by the states, and these people would literally buy their way into the U.S. Senate. And the people rose up and revolted. There was a great crash in 1896. And in large part as a consequence of that crash, we saw, and then it was followed by a war, the Spanish-American War. And the outcome of this was a populist and progressive rebellion. And that populist and progressive rebellion led to some substantial changes. In 1909, the Tillman Act was passed, for example. Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican president, passed the Tillman Act, which made it a felony for a federal official to give money to any political candidate for federal office. There were laws passed in virtually every state in the United States that made it a crime for anyone to give money to anybody for any political purpose. In fact, I have a copy of one of these laws. This is just incredible. This is an actual state law. This is from Wisconsin. Tell that to Scott Walker, right? This was on the books. I mean, this is one that came out of that progressive backlash era, and it wasn't taken off the books until the 1950s. And here, I'll just read it to you, very straightforward. No corporation doing business in this state shall pay or contribute or offer consent or agree to pay or contribute directly or indirectly any money, property, free service of its officers or employees or thing of value to any political party whatsoever, or excuse me, organization, committee, or individual for any political purpose whatsoever, or for the purpose of influencing legislation of any kind, or to promote or defeat the candidacy of any person for the nomination, appointment, or election to any political office. And then the penalty, and this wasn't just a, gee, wouldn't it be nice? Here's the penalty phase. Any officer, employee, agent, attorney, or other representative, right? In other words, even a lobbyist, anybody who shall violate this act shall be punished upon conviction by imprisonment in the state prison for a period of not less than 1 nor more than 5 years, and if a domestic corporation, it may be dissolved, and if a foreign or non-resident corporation, its right to do business in this state is forfeit. I mean, we knew how to respond to corruption by big corporations and wealthy individuals, and we did. And it wasn't just the Tillman Act, and it wasn't just laws like that. We had many states, Washington State is one of them, passed laws allowing or altered their constitutions, allowing people to go around the legislature and directly change or affect their laws. Many states, at a federal level, we passed the direct election of the Senate so that we get to elect our senators. Women got the right to vote. This all came out of this. I mean, and these, by the way, those two things were constitutional amendments. People say you can't amend the Constitution. No, you can. It's not that difficult. And in fact, during the last progressive populist revolt, when we needed to take back democracy from the whack jobs, we did it. And so, and we did it quite quickly, actually. I mean, it took about a generation. It took about 2 decades. Our current crisis, however, is in many ways more severe than that crisis was. Because back then, you didn't have a Supreme Court saying that George Washington fought the Revolutionary War to protect the East India Company and the billionaires in Europe, and you didn't have a Supreme Court that said that Abraham Lincoln fought the Civil War to protect the corporations. Back then, there was no doctrine that corporations are people or that, they were trying, right? Santa Clara County in 1886 and several other decisions, but they really, really didn't have corporate power back then like that. And there was no idea that money was protected by the First Amendment and that corporations were protected by the 14th Amendment. In fact, in 1976, in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo, which was the beginning of the end, really, of the idea that money and free speech are different things. It was the beginning of the blending of the two. But even in that decision, they didn't go that far. Instead, they said that money was, quote, that you could regulate money in the political process because you could regulate conduct. And it was a regulation of conduct to regulate money. And now the Supreme Court, of course, says if you try to regulate money in the political process, you're regulating free speech. And I didn't know that money was speech. I mean, I don't hear that many things coming out of my wallet, or out of my pocket. It's not, hey down there, no, let us out. It's not happening. But all that changed with Citizens United and McCutcheon, and now corporations have become people and money has become speech. And at the same time that money has become speech and the corporations become persons, there's an interesting history to that. It goes back to 1886. when the Supreme Court didn't decide that corporations are people, but the clerk of the court, John Chandler Bancroft Davis, said that it did in a head note, and that's been quoted forever. And I wrote a book about that called Unequal Protection. And it's like the biggest scam that's been foisted on the American people. But in addition to that, we now have, a whole series of Supreme Court decisions since that time that have basically, ratified that notion that corporations are people. And this modern era started with a fellow by the name of Lewis Powell. And this gets into the crash of 2016. This is about the middle third of the book. In 1971, Lewis Powell was a tobacco lawyer in Virginia, a nice, soft-spoken guy. He was actually a very gentleman. He was a Southern gentleman. But he worked for the tobacco industry. And a few years before that, a couple of big things had happened. One was that Rachel Carlson had published Silent Spring in the 60s, in the mid-60s, and produced this incredible movement, this incredible backlash of people saying, no, wait a minute, I want to know what's in my food, I don't want these pesticides and things. So that happened. And then on top of that, you had Ralph Nader published a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, and about how the car companies didn't give a rat's patootie about us, they just wanted to make a profit. And that sparked a consumer movement. And so suddenly corporate America fell under siege. And Lewis Powell, being a tobacco lawyer, could see what was going to happen 20 years out in the future. I mean, he couldn't literally see the future, but he had a sense of the way things were going. And that, the way things were going was that, we the people were going to come after them. So he said, in this memo to Eugene Sindor, his next-door neighbor and friend at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, he said, we've got to get politically active. The Chamber of Commerce has to get politically active. Up until '71, the Chamber of Commerce had always just been basically a business organization. I mean, hang on just a minute, this wire's making me crazy. I'm going to give it a little slack here and try and hook this thing. There we go. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce had not been a political organization prior to that point. And so what he was saying was, we have to capture the courts and the judges. This led to the creation of the Federalist Society. We need to create think tanks to influence public opinion. That led to the creation of the Heritage Foundation and others. We need to take over the schools, so now we have colleges all over the United States where right-wing foundations and right-wing billionaires fund political departments and economics departments and control who gets hired and who's allowed to teach and what books are used. We need to take over Congress, basically. We need to own our politicians. And then Lewis Powell, 3 months later, Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. And surprise, surprise, he helped write the opinions in the Buckley case, and a year later in First National Bank versus Bellotti, which was the first time that the United States Supreme Court had said that a corporation had political freedom of speech, that they conflated the two, that the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment were somehow tied together. Now, it got tied together really, all in a bow in Citizens United in 2010. So, as a consequence of this, we're back where we were in 1906 when Teddy Roosevelt was railing about the influence of money in politics and calling for the Tillman Act and for laws like that Wisconsin law that I just read to you. He said, we've got to change these things. And so, and again, people are saying, but you can't amend the Constitution. It's too big a job. It takes too much time. It's a big hassle. But the fact of the matter is that, we did back then, and in fact, most recently, the 26th Amendment of the Constitution in 1971. It was proposed in March of 1971. It was ratified in July. It took 3 months. It took 3 months and 8 days. The big song that was #1 on the billboards that year was Barry McGuire's Eve of Destruction. And in that song was a line, "You're old enough to kill, but not for voting." And the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 down to 18. And it was, of course, during the Vietnam War. And people were upset about the fact that they could be drafted, but they couldn't vote. And so I still think that we can pass a constitutional amendment in 3 months and 8 days. It's still possible. And in fact, you know, this is yes on I-1329. This is the effort here in Washington State to make that happen. And here's the amendment that is proposed. This is from move2amend.org, but there's a bunch of good ones out here, but just some very simple, straightforward language. This is what we need to say. Because keep in mind, no legislature has ever passed at the state or federal level in the history of the United States, no legislature has ever passed a law saying corporations are protected by the 14th Amendment and are people, and speech is and money is protected by the First Amendment and is considered speech. It's never passed any legislature in any state or at the federal level, ever. No governor has ever signed such a law, no president has ever signed or even proposed such a law. In fact, presidents have condemned such laws or such policies since literally the 1787 Grover Cleveland State of the Union address, in which he talked about the iron boot of corporations being on the necks of ordinary citizens. It's a verbatim phrase out of his 1887 State of the Union address. Go back, look it up. So this amendment has very, very simple language. Section 1, the rights protected by the Constitution of the United States are the rights of natural persons only. Artificial entities shall have no rights under this Constitution and are subject to regulation by the people through federal, state, or local law. In Section 2, the judiciary shall not construe the spending of money to influence elections to be speech under the First Amendment. Now, there are a few more words in there, but it's straightforward stuff. So how do we make this happen? We get active. And that brings it down to the very, very, very simple thing. Tag, you're it. Thank you very much. And so I'm gonna actually let that be my the main. Well, actually, not my whole speech. I want to talk a little bit about the crash of 2016 because that's theoretically the reason why I'm here. But the crash of 2016 is coming about because of what I just shared with you. It's coming about because our political process has been so badly corrupted by the corporations and by the billionaires that they've ruined our banking structures, they've ruined our business structures, they've ruined our trade structures, and our economy just doesn't work anymore for anybody who's not part of the 1%. And the crash really, what really set it up in a big way was not just Reaganomics and not just free trade policy. Those guaranteed that America would slide into third world status. But what really set up the crash were two pieces of legislation that were promoted by Phil Gramm, whose wife Wendy was on the board of Enron. And these were bills that Ken Lay wanted passed. And the Commodities Futures Modernization Act and Gramm-Leach-Bliley. And what these did is they allowed companies like Enron, to become banks, because Enron was having problems with banks. They had 800 subsidiary companies they were playing shell games with, and the banks didn't like it, and they wanted to be their own bank. And B, they wanted to be able to gamble within their own bank with commodities, specifically energy commodities. Enron didn't live to see the day, but the banksters are still doing it. They're still at it. And they're doing it in particular with food and oil in ways that are really, really harming our environment. And so we had this crash that started in 2007 with the housing collapse, that went large in 2008 with the stock market crash. And then President Obama came into office, and during that brief little 9 or 11-month window there, between the time that Ted Kennedy died and the time that Scott Brown got sworn in as his replacement, out of the 6 years that the president has been president, he's only had a filibuster-proof Senate for 10 or 11 months, for less than a year. And during that period of time, he got like 27 pieces of legislation passed through both the House and the Senate, including a massive stimulus act that literally prevented us from sliding into a Great Depression, Obamacare, and a whole bunch of other really good, some good stuff actually happened. But these Republicans are so committed to making sure that this president, and for some of them, it's just because he's a Democrat. I mean, they felt the same way about Bill Clinton. They kept trying to impeach him. But they did actually vote for legislation during Bill Clinton's presidency. But for some of them, it's that he's the first black president, and they just can't deal with that. And they just are so committed to this guy going down in history as the failed president that they're not allowing anything to happen. We have the lowest level of legislative activity in the history of the United States, literally in the history of the United States. And it's because if he likes it, they won't go for it. And if he doesn't like it, well, you know, it's obviously it's not going to happen. So, but it's like so it's just it's crazy. And so the fundamental changes that needed to happen in 2008, when George Bush was president and the crash happened, when the banks started falling apart, we have a precedent for what to do when banks start falling apart. And in fact, Ronald Reagan showed us in the United States. Sweden did it in '97, but we saw it here in the United States in 1987. In '83, Reagan deregulated savings and loans, which led directly to the crash of the savings and loans. And that crash of the savings and loans then just, you know, set up, for all practical purposes, I mean, you know, made inevitable, frankly, made inevitable the idea that there would be a stock market crash. Excuse me, the crash of the savings, when Reagan crashed the savings and loans, what he did was he nationalized them. And nationalizing the savings and loans, he basically said to the stockholders, you're screwed, you guys. You're losing your investment. Stockholders lost their investment. He fired all the senior management. He prosecuted, over 1,000 of them were prosecuted, over 800 of them went to jail. Charles Keating was the most famous of that bunch. Sent these guys to jail. And eventually, he hired a guy named Bill Seidman, who ran the Resolution Trust Corporation, and over the period of the next 25 years, he sold these nationalized, now federally owned savings and loans back into the public market, into the private market, and actually made a profit for the government on the S&L crash. Sweden did the same thing with their banks. This is what George Bush should have done in 2008. He should have said, okay, cool, we'll break up the banks and we'll take over the banks. We can run banks. It's not a secret. There are good people out there who know how to run banks, and they'll do it for a reasonable price. You don't have to pay Jamie Dimon hundreds of millions of dollars. But George Bush chose not to do that. Instead, he and the Fed chose to hand literally tens of trillions of dollars to banksters and rich people, not just in this country, but all over the world, to try to keep this crash from happening. And when Obama came into office, there had already been 2 TARPs passed. There had been basically an amnesty for the bankers, and there was no way that he could get Congress to go along with doing what Reagan did in '86, tragically, because the die had been cast by George Bush, in large part, and also because they were just committed to destroying the Obama presidency. And so we still have, as a consequence of this, a broken financial system. And so what they've been doing for the last 6 years is just reinflating the bubble. And it's a bubble economy. And you read the Financial Times and the papers, you know, where the rich people are talking to the rich people, and they're all like, you know, are you in cash yet? You getting out of the stock market yet? It's like, you know, it's like everybody's just, they're walking on eggshells because they know that another crash is coming. I suggest 2016 because if you look back at the crash of 2008, the Bush administration knew in 2006 that that crash was coming. They knew in 2007, the second quarter of 2007, when housing starts dropped 30%, which they had done in 1927. The numbers were almost identical. They knew that when what happened in 27 happened in 2007, what happened in 29 would probably happen within a year. And so they were trying to stop 1929 stock market crash scenarios from happening before November of 2008, before the election. Because they knew that, you know, having a Republican go into the election would not be a good thing in the middle of a stock market crash. But they couldn't do it. They miscalculated. They couldn't, I mean, the forces were just too great. There were hundreds of trillions of dollars of these derivatives out there. And so the crash happened. I see the Obama administration doing the same thing. And I don't say this out of malice or spite or, you know, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. It's politically the smart thing. Is, you know, you want your party, and in fact, I want a Democrat to be elected in 2016. I would rather the crash did not happen before November of 2016, because the future of the Supreme Court is at stake. Even if it's a mediocre Democrat, I don't care. I don't want a Republican appointing a bunch of Supreme Court justices, and Scalia is in his late 70s, Kennedy is in his mid-70s, you've got, you know, Thomas is in his late 60s. You've got a bunch of these right-wingers who are reaching the age of retirement, or even possibly, I'm not wishing it on them, but, you know, people do kick off. And so, you know, they're trying to hold this thing off until 2016. And I'm not sure they'll be able to do it. You know, it might happen next week. It might not be for 2 more years. But it hasn't happened yet, and it will. Because the market fundamentals, the systems are broken. Our basic core systems are broken. And until we fix those systems, and frankly, I don't think we're going to fix those systems until there's a popular outcry, and I don't think there's going to be a popular outcry until there's a crash. And I hate to say that. I know a lot of people are going to get hurt by that crash. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of people have been hurt by the crash of 2008 and by the Republicans for 6 years trying to make it as painful as possible for people, cutting off their unemployment, not doing anything about the mortgages, all these other things, and trying to make it as painful as possible for people so that they can win political advantage in the elections. You know, this is terrible, terrible politics. But this is how it's being played out right now, in large part, starting with Lewis Powell's memo. So we've got to do something about that. We've got to get ready for it. And when that happens, when that crash happens, there will be that populist opportunity. There will be that populist moment. I see it building right now in the popularity of people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. You see this, and on the right, frankly, with the Tea Party, what you're seeing is populism. You're seeing people saying, we're being ignored, we're being screwed, we're not going to put up with it anymore. We may not know who's ignoring us or who's screwing us, but we're not going to put up with it anymore. And so I think that when that crash happens, when that moment in time, when that opportunity is there, we need to be ready. We need to have our friends educated. If each one of us can wake up 4 or 5 people, tell as many people as possible, so that we can do what the progressives and populists did the last time we went through this cycle, where they amended the Constitution twice. They passed a bunch of very, very substantial laws. They reinvented American society. Look at what Franklin Roosevelt did with Social Security and the WPA and the CCC and the TVA and all these other things. We can do this again. We know how to do it. It's not like it's never been done. It's not like we've never figured it out. So get ready, and there's tremendous opportunity here. There's tremendous opportunity here. And climate change is, of course, roiling the waters. It's making all of this even worse. And here's an opportunity for us also, as people are waking up about the dangers of climate change, to transition ourselves from a fossil fuel economy to a solar economy, which could be the equivalent for the United States of the Industrial Revolution of the 1870s. I mean, it could be the biggest thing that ever happened to this country. And all we have to do is get the fossils, forgive the pun, out of the way. You know, you've got to move the fossil fuel industry and some of these old Republicans in office out, and that means, again, back to what I said earlier and what I say on the radio every day, getting politically active. Tag, you're it. So that's it. Let's do a short question and answer here. I do this on the radio every day. We've got microphones on both sides. If one request I would ask is, if you want to give a speech or inform me, call the station, use our message board. There's a whole variety of ways to get information to me. But if you have a question, I'd be glad to answer it. Sir?
There seems to be a real poverty of leadership among both parties. I'm wondering, when these problems, where are we going to find the people that can objectively lead us out of these, recognize the situation it is and lead us out?
That's a great question, and your question presupposes what I call the great man theory of governance. It assumes that you need the right person to lead us. And when we look back at history, we say, wow, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, these great men, where are they now? I'm not a fan of the great man of theory of history. I think that what you find is that people step up to situations. Franklin Roosevelt is probably the most classic example. Franklin Roosevelt was a rich guy. He was a privileged guy. He had no great compassion for the common man. I mean, he was not a wild progressive as governor of New York. He was a reasonable governor, but New York was arguably the most corrupt state in the United States. It's a huge political machine in New York. Governor Roosevelt did nothing about that. He ran for president in '32 on a platform of free trade and dropping tariffs and slowly continuing the plans that Hoover had put into place. But when he got into office, he had an Occupy movement to deal with. I mean, they had left by the time he got there. Hoover had busted them up, but for 2 years you had people who had camped from the White House all the way down to the Potomac, the bonus army. He had a nation, every bank in the country failed the week before he went into office, before he became sworn in March of 1933. And so the Times propelled FDR. And that's why, people call up the program and they go, oh my God, we're going to get Hillary Clinton for president. And my response is, I'm no huge fan of Hillary. I think that she's a very smart woman. But I also know she was on the board of directors of Walmart back in the day. Of course, her husband wanted to become governor of Arkansas, and that was sort of the dance you had to do. But she does know how to take names and kick ass. And I do believe that that she or any other Democrat, frankly, if they have the intestinal fortitude to take the opportunity, and if the situation is severe enough, they'll do it. So I'm not so concerned about where the leaders are going to come from. I'm concerned about the timing of the circumstances. Yes.
Speaking of timing, the time is now, and you're absolutely right. My name is Libby Carr, and I'm the campaign manager for 1329. And the time is very, very propitious right now. We are at a point where we have to consider hiring paid signature gatherers if we're going to make it onto the ballot. So many of us don't want to do that, but I think the majority of us want to be on the ballot because we know the state of Washington is at a very important time in history because this is the largest effort of a citizens' initiative in the country to date. And a lot of states are looking at our state. I've gotten calls from Illinois and other places wanting to do this. Right. So my question for you is, will you help us? And what I mean by that, Tom, is we need the media exposure now.
Sure.
And I think the idea is that if we can get the country focused on the state of Washington to send us the money that we have got to have to get on the ballot, we will then pay it forward to the next state. And I think a movement can be created with the momentum that we've started here. And it's too hard. If we fail now, it's really hard. I mean, we don't want to fail. We want to succeed. And we could really use your help to succeed.
Well, I'm not stripping up here to give you the shirt off my back. But my recommendation is have somebody from your organization call into my program every day.
I've called a number of times, but I'd like to get through. And
well, I'll sensitize Danielle, our call screener, to this.
We need some publicity. I'd appreciate it.
We'll promote it.
Thank you.
We can't do it alone, but we'll do it. Sure.
For anyone wanting a petition afterwards, we'll be outside. We bought about 300 extra petitions for this crowd to carry.
Well, and here's the other thing. Let me just encourage every single one of you to become petition gatherers. Please.
Since this is going to be an economic crisis, supposedly, can you talk a little bit about the benefits of having a state bank system?
Yeah, sure. Very, very, very straightforward stuff. State banks are banks that are owned by the state rather than owned by private corporations or stockholders or billionaires or even communities. I mean, there are some community-owned banks around the country. Typically, we call them, what do you call them? Credit unions, thank you. Long day. But North Dakota has had a state-owned bank. Again, this was one of the products that came out of the populist revolt of the early 19th century, or the early 20th century, the early 1900s. And it has served North Dakota very, very well. So yeah, I'm a big fan of state banks, and I would encourage you, if you want another ballot initiative to get involved with, or if you want to start lobbying your members of the state legislature, that's a really high priority, because I guarantee you, Washington State is sitting on billions of dollars that are, you know, between pension funds and just normal operating funds, that are creating millions of dollars in profits for Chase and Citibank, and that's crazy. Keep the money here in Washington. Yes, sir.
Thom, thank you for sharing so many fascinating scientific studies on your show. Sorely needed. If you've shared this one, I haven't heard you do it. The experiment done in 1965 by Rautenberg and Lindy. Electrodes were wired up to the pleasure center of a rat's brain, which the rat could stimulate by pressing a lever, or they could press a different lever to get food. What they learned is that a rat will push the pleasure lever continuously, ignoring food, ignoring water, until the rat dies.
Right.
I got a shock of recognition from this when I read that some traders say that making a really good transaction is a bigger high for them than sex, which to me sounds insane. But this is them describing
This is the
themselves.
mechanism of addiction, is what you're describing.
Among other things, yeah. And so what I wonder, though, a question for you, these are not stupid people. I'm sure they're not all climate change deniers. But could it be some of them aren't capable of saving their own lives, knowing and accepting the scientific consensus on climate change? I mean, they work for the same moneyed interests that pressure our government to take huge risks with our economy, and they want to do the same with our environment. I think this is the most primal problem we face in affecting any real change. We obviously need more than just regulation. We need to somehow contain the
Let me take it a
predators.
step beyond that. It's not just the useful idiots like the guys who come on my radio and TV show and debate climate change, although I haven't had one on for about a year. I just quit doing it. It's like, it's not, I'm not even pretending that there's a debate anymore. But really what it is, in my opinion, the rats that you're talking about are the people who are doing the modern day Scrooge McDuck. They have obsessive compulsive disorder. They have a hoarding disorder. If they were middle-class people, you would see them on TV with a living room full of newspapers all the way up to the ceiling that you had to navigate through, and a kitchen full of old tin cans. But instead, they have $40 billion in the bank, and they're trying to get to $80 billion. And you know, they don't care what happens to the world. They don't care what happens to anybody else. You get this mentality. I mean, the ugly face of this mentality was on display with Mr. Sterling's comments, you know, the other day. You know, I think we have, as much as we have a climate change denial problem, what's feeding it even larger is 2,000 trillion tons of carbon underground, which is on the books of 7 big fossil companies, and that are controlled by multimillionaires and billionaires who don't want to lose that money. And we have a billionaire problem, and we've got to do something about that. I thought.
Yes,
sir.
After learning about the sterling silver spectacle, it seemed that it got immediate results. As tawdry as the process of capturing the information, it seemed to work, and he's out of our lives.
You're talking about the NBA?
Yes, the Clippers, the owner of the Clippers, I'm sorry. Why not, when the minimum wage just recently failed and the Senate couldn't muster a 60% vote, why not publicize these people who voted against this relatively harmless new policy, just upgrading people, giving them a chance to live? Why not publicize their private lives? Where do they vacation? Where do they send their children to school? That type of thing.
Well, you know, I don't think that ad hominem, you know, going after the person attacks are going to be successful, first of all. But secondly, what Sterling did was I'm still chewing on this. I'm still trying to figure this out, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it on the radio this coming week. The Rude Pundit had a really thought-provoking column wherever he publishes his blog. Yeah, I saw it on Democratic Underground yesterday. And he said, you know, this Sterling guy, Donald Sterling, he's been picking on poor black people for 35 years. I mean, he's been throwing them out of their houses, he's been calling them names, his wife has called them names to their faces. Nobody ever said anything. It's just, you know, but they're poor black people. I mean, there was a lawsuit and he paid some people off to go away, but basically it was poor black people. Then he said something about rich black people. And see, this illustrates the confluence of race and class in our society. I keep saying it's not just a race issue, it's a class issue as well. And you know, Sterling took on rich black guys, and you can, at that point, you can take the black out. You know, he had been trashing, he made $1 billion trashing poor people. He trashes some rich people, they kick his ass. And so, you know, I'm not sure what lesson to draw out of that, because it's really kind of disheartening, because, you know, basically what that, you know, that reinforces Gillen's research that the rich get what they want and the poor don't. So, you know, like I said, I'm still chewing that one on my brain, and I'll have further thoughts about it next week. But I put it out for your consideration. I don't know what the solution to this is, other than getting money out of politics, and so that the average people can get involved again, which takes us back to our constitutional amendment, which takes us back to all of you becoming, you know, signature gatherers for this ballot initiative. Well, step one, get money out of government. Yes, sir.
So, Tom, are you proposing that we somehow solicit millionaires for our cause? Is that billionaires? Is that...
No, although, you know, Ralph Nader wrote a book 2 years ago called Only the Billionaires Will Save Us. And I had Ralph on my show, and I said, Ralph, you know, have you lost it? It's like, really? And he was like, no, seriously, you know, it's like the billionaires who are oppressing us, and there are a few enlightened billionaires out there, and we need to, and there are. I mean, I've met a couple of them, in fact, I was at a retreat in Vermont with one about 6 months ago, which was a very interesting thing. You know, so the Silicon Valley guy who's now worth $3.5 billion, and he's funding all kinds of really good stuff. And he's not crazy, and he's not obsessive, and he's not acquisitive. He just happened to be one of the early guys who invented something that became something, you know. So he's not your typical billionaire. But anyhow, Ralph, I think, I can't speak for Ralph, but his newest book is not asking the billionaires to help us anymore. So that's, yeah.
This kind of leads into my question, which is, we know we have this problem with organization and trying to get these issues out there. And you know a lot about the Constitution. We've had direct democracy. Now we've got this two-party system that's institutionalized, and we don't have control over it. And then you're talking about a progressive approach. And I'm just wondering, what is that structure that you see? Because that's something you can tell us about? Or, I mean, how does...
What are you talking about?
The idea of a progressive solution. What's that look like?
I think it's a simple matter of progressives taking over the political process. The progressive revolution that happened from 1904, arguably, until you know, 1940, that was done by both Democrats and Republicans. You know, Taft followed Roosevelt. He was a Republican too. He busted up Standard Oil. Roosevelt started it, but Taft finished it. Just like Nixon started busting up AT&T, Carter finished it. You know, the reality is that we don't have a proportional representation system in the United States. If the Green Party gets 3% of the votes, sorry, they're not going to have 3% of the seats in Congress. Changing the Constitution to fix that is something that I think is way too big a lift. That requires much more understanding on the part of the average person than just money is screwing up government, which this constitutional amendment, that's all you have to say to people. You know, money, you know, let's get money out of government. Cool, where do I sign? You know, you say to people, let's have proportional representation. They go, huh? So I think that, you know, we're stuck with this two-party system. So I go back to 2010, the Concord Coalition, I think it is, maybe it's Project, whatever it is, you can find it online. They've got a bunch of YouTubes. They had these DVRs that they were passing out, and they were doing house parties all over the country, and they were teaching Republican activists, Tea Party activists, how to show up at the Republican Party and take it over. And the fact of the matter is, and I've been at a few of these, and I've had probably 100 people call the program in the years since I wrote that book, Screwed, back in 2008, when I first told the story of 3 people who did this. I've had, you know, at least 100 people call and say, yeah, I showed up at the local Democratic Party, and there was like 6 guys there, and they were all in their 70s, and you know, it's basically a social club. And so I came back, you know, the next month when the elections were happening, and I brought 35 friends, and now we run the local Democratic Party. And this is I mean, this is exactly how the Tea Party took over the Republican Party. And this is how, I mean, the Democratic Party, it's a $1 billion machine. If you wanted to take over NBC, good luck. You know, how much, can you imagine how much money we'd have to raise to take over a network? But you can take over a political party without a penny. You just have to damn show up. I mean, it's, so anyway, yes, sir.
Turns out you can actually teach the rats to become addicted to punishment and teach them that they'll shock themselves.
Sorry?
They'll become addicted to punishment and they'll shock themselves to death. It's really sad to watch. But my question for you is if, if we lose the internet with the end of net neutrality, if we can't reestablish that, can you think of another means by which we can keep in touch and build a movement?
Well, I don't think the internet is going to go away. It's just going to get more expensive. I mean, just like, you know, our phone service didn't go away. I mean, cell service, I was in Germany 2 weekends ago. One of my best friends had a massive heart attack, and I went over to visit him. And you know, he's got a cell phone, he's got a smartphone with digital data on it. You know, just like my iPhone. My iPhone costs $100+ a month. His is like, I think 28 or 31 or something like that a month. Why? Because he can buy it from 30 or 40 different providers. You know, they've got real competition there. They actually enforce their antitrust acts there. So I don't think that the end of net neutrality is going to be the death of the internet. I don't think it's going to be a, you know, doom and gloom scenario. It's going to be a pain in the ass scenario. You know, pardon?
Larry and Sergey can save us.
Yeah, I only heard half of that. What can save us?
Larry and Sergey.
Oh, Larry and Sergey. Sergey, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm fairly incensed about Tom Wheeler, you know, setting himself up for his $2 million job when he leaves the FCC.
But if they demand $1 million a year from you to...
It's not a good thing. I mean, you know, it's not a good thing, and it's something that's worth being an activist about. But I think that the number one thing we have to do now, see, if we got money out of politics, things like Tom Wheeler wouldn't be happening.
We better do
and
it.
That's, which brings us back to the 28th Amendment. Yes, sir.
Hi, what can I tell my poorly misguided Republican twin brother who will be the legislative agenda post-crash, you know, to get rid of this horrible income inequality that we have in America today?
Right. One of the things that makes actually sense to Republicans who are capable of doing math is that if you look at the history of the United States or any other country, pick one, what you find, a modern economy, an industrialized economy, what you find is that when the top income tax on income over roughly $3 million a year, in whatever the day's dollars are, when it's over 50%, that you have long periods of stability in your economy. And the reason why is because people take their $3 million a year and then stop. And at that point, they put the money back in the company, they reinvest it, they pay their employees well, they provide pensions, they do R&D, they build, it's like, hey, why give money to the government? And that's why from 1930 until 1985, the average CEO in the United States took 30 times what the average worker takes. But when the top income tax drops below 50%, what happens is what happened when Harding dropped it from 91% down to 25% in 1920. And then Roosevelt took it back up to 90% in 34, I think it was. But you know, you have the roaring 20s, you have a bubble economy. And what happened when Reagan dropped it down to 28% in 1987? And you have another bubble economy. And we are still in a bubble economy. So the first thing is to get the income tax above the top marginal rate. It has no effect whatsoever on the average person, none. But you get that top marginal rate above $3 million, and at that point, you don't have all this hot money flowing through the system where people are just, you know, they didn't have to work that hard to get it. It's not that dear to them. They're not so worried about it, and so they're willing to gamble it and things like derivatives and stuff. So that's a starting point. That's just a really good starting point. Beyond that, I'd say look at the entire New Deal. It's all worth replicating. Yeah.
On the idea that money is free speech, as the Supreme Court has said, apparently, I heard a recent show of Bill Maher who said, wait a minute, money isn't free speech, money is the microphone, and the Constitution never guaranteed you a giant microphone. And I really like that, so my question to you is, what do you think of that as to its substance, and as a radio person, what do you think of it as a good quip to kind of get out there and get people thinking about?
Yeah, it's a good one. Bill Maher is the master of one-liners, and that's a particularly good one. What I like is let me find it again here, was in the Buckley case that money in politics could be regulated because you were regulating conduct. That money was conduct. You were buying things, you were doing things with money, which is different from speech. And we have a long history of regulating conduct in the United States. And we have a long history of respecting the right of freedom of speech. So yeah, a microphone is another form of conduct. Yeah, I'm with you. Yes.
Tom, it's Jane Christensen, poet in your chat room.
Hi, Jane.
You made
great.
it. You're late.
Pardon?
But I almost lost faith in you, but you showed up. I'm so happy.
Oh, thank you.
So, Tom, I've been a listener of you for a long time. I met Louise. I was on the Argosy cruises for the lunches, you know. And I'm one of the radicals in your chat room who we kind of lean socialist and communist. We don't think capitalism is any good.
I've noticed.
And I know, but hey, can I go on the show first and have a conversation with great citizens on Main Street?
Say that again?
I want to go on your show sometime and talk with you.
Okay.
I'm from Main Street. You need people like us. You don't have any of us. You know?
Oh, you mean as a guest?
Yeah. Yeah.
Pitch it to Sean. She's the gatekeeper.
15 now.
Yeah.
So my question is, because I might have ADHD and I'm among the low-class working poor, I mean the higher-end working poor. I have to go to work sometimes. I want to know, in case I missed it, what informs you in your life and in your studies and in your intelligence to believe that we can change capitalism by using capitalism, by the methods of capitalism?
That's a very good question. I think, and thank you for that, and thank you for being one of the socialists in our chat room, because thank you, me too, back at you, because I'm with you. Capitalism, and I've said this many, many times, I wrote a book called Screwed about it, and it's wonderful that Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, is getting such widespread claim, even though it's a 700-page tome. Capitalism does not produce a middle class, and it does not necessarily produce prosperity. Capitalism produces Victorian-era Europe. You know, the world that Charles Dickens wrote about was the result of relatively unregulated capitalism. And it's important to remember that Scrooge, in A Christmas Carol, Scrooge was the middle class. The middle class was the small shop owners, right? Scrooge owned a two-man business. He was a small businessman, right? He was not a rich guy. I mean, he was the middle class. So you have a small middle class, you have a small, very wealthy class, and then you have a huge class of the working poor. And that's the direction we've been moving in ever since Reaganomics came in. You have to have heavily regulated capitalism, and you have to have a strong social component within the body politic and the body economic, which is what we had with FDR-onomics and what we lost with Reaganomics. And it's why the United States has become more like Victorian England. And you know, we need to, you know, I'm not inherently, explicitly opposed to capitalism per se. I am totally opposed to unregulated capitalism or capitalism as the only economic system within a political body. I think that we need a lot more worker co-ops, which are communalism, arguably communism. We need certainly socialism. We need government protecting the commons in a big way. We need more, the democratic socialism. Look at the countries in Northern Europe. They've got it figured out. So, Miranda, how are we doing with time, by the way?
About 30 till.
So when should I stop?
There's a lot of folks who want to ask questions, maybe another 15 minutes.
Another 15 minutes? Okay. And then you're just going to jump in and tell me to shut up, right? Okay. Miranda's the boss, so.
Hi, Tom. I think that a nation is not considered wealthy by how much the wealthiest few have. It's wealthy when the least among you has a certain amount of wealth.
I agree.
And I don't think it's about GDP either. So what would you consider a good indicator or index as to the wealth of a country?
The wealth of a nation, yeah. It's okay, it's on. Her point was that, one of the best measurements of the quality of life in a country and the wealth of a country really is not how many Bill Gates do you have, but how is the life of the people at the bottom of the economic scale. And in that regard, there are a lot of countries that do a lot better than us. The very poor in Holland are better off than the bottom end of the working middle class in the United States, for example. And increasingly, this is the case with country after country after country. We are no longer, number one, certainly with regard to our middle class. In terms of some way to calibrate it or understand it, there are a lot of suggestions that have been made, but I think that the Gini coefficient is called the GINI coefficient, and it's a ratio of extreme wealth to extreme poverty in a country. It's a measure of inequality. Is really a good one to use. And our Gini coefficient has almost doubled since Reagan's presidency, which is a really bad thing. And there's a really good book about this, two actually good books about it, by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, two British economists. They're both published in the UK, but they're available in the United States. The first is called Why Inequality Matters. That came out about 8 years ago. And the second is called The Spirit Level, which came out about 3 years ago. And they have a website called inequalitytrust.org.uk. And you can just easily Google inequality Wilkerson, inequality Pickett, inequality Spirit Level, and you can find all this stuff. And but we need, the really good news in my mind is that we're starting to have that conversation on the pages of the New York Times today, whereas the last time we really seriously had that conversation in the United States was during the 1960s, during the Great Society, and it got subsumed by the Vietnam War, tragically. Lyndon Johnson, had he not had the Vietnam War, I think would have been seen as one of our greatest presidents. And even though I got arrested protesting him, I mean, I was out in the street, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? But you look back on what he did, and it was extraordinary. And we need that again. Thank you. Yes?
This is a little off subject, but we just surpassed last year's record number of earthquakes in Oklahoma in the first 4 months this year. And I haven't seen, we watch you adamantly, and I haven't seen you do much on that. And I think it's an extremely important
issue. It's fracking.
Pardon?
That's fracking. It's not, actually, it's not even fracking. It's the injection of the wastewater from fracking.
Right, yeah. In my opinion, I work for an oil company, which is bad, but I think that's a bigger issue than the pipeline, and the pipeline is going to go right through Oklahoma where those earthquakes are taking place too. And I think this needs more coverage, and I would. Yeah. Like
in October of 2008, there was a drunk guy, a drunk hunter, up in Alaska, and he fired his a pretty high-powered rifle. Fired a pretty high-powered rifle at what he thought was a moose, and it was the pipeline. Yeah. And 1 million spilled gallons later, a bush pilot flying over noticed this giant half-mile wide pool of black stuff on the ground. I mean, pipelines are craziness. You know, it's just they're crazy. And I agree. Running them across an earthquake area is crazy. Running them across the Ogallala Aquifer is crazy. Running them across 8 navigable waterways is crazy. And running them from a god-awful form of carbon in Canada to get them to the Gulf Coast of the United States with the explicit and stated purpose. They don't even make a secret about it. This is on TransCanada's website. Their goal is not to sell that into the US market. Their goal is to refine it in Texas, leave the poisons here in the United States, make Cancer Alley going down Texas and Louisiana 5 times larger, and sell that diesel fuel and gasoline into the European, the Central and South American markets, and the Chinese markets. They are explicit about it. In fact, TransCanada on their website says they expect that when the pipeline is completed, the cost of gasoline in the United States will go up by about 15 cents a gallon. Because right now they're refining that gas in the Midwest, because the pipeline does stop in the Midwest, and it is being sold in the US market. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the #1 export of the United States, we used to export televisions and computers and refrigerators and clothes and blue jeans and all kinds of cool stuff. The #1 export of the United States last year was refined petroleum products. #1 export, gasoline and diesel fuel. That's what we're selling. And we keep the poisons. So, you know, they get the money, we get the poison, China gets the gasoline. This is not a good deal. Yes, sir.
It appears to me that the most highly leveraged...
hang on just a second. And if I may add, the largest individual private owner, American private owner of tar sands oil in Canada, who stands to make billions if this pipeline is completed and refined in Texas, are the Koch brothers.
Shocking.
Yeah. Not a surprise.
2-part question. Part 1, it appears to me that until there's a 28th Amendment that's passed nationally, nothing else really is going to do much good. I don't know if that's your perception, but I perceive that as the most highly leveraged activity that we can do. If there's anything more than that, I would love your input to do those things, but I've been putting all of my resources towards that.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with you. There are a lot of people who are offering some really nice suggestions. You know, Larry Lessig has this thing of let's do what New York State did. In New York State, or maybe it's New York City, if you make a contribution of under a certain amount, I think it's $100, they'll match it 6 times, you know, to a candidate. So that small contributions have, you know, a larger effect. I mean, there's all kinds of cool stuff that you can do, but in my opinion, it's all nibbling around the edges. You're right. The most heavily leveraged activity you can do is roll back these 2 judge-created doctrines that corporations are protected by the 14th Amendment and our persons, and that money is protected by the First Amendment and is speech. So,
real quick,
Miranda's cutting me off.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, 2 more questions. Thank you.
Real quick, just a second follow-up question. I'm 35 years old. I look around, I come to things like this, and I see a lot of people that are twice my age, and I get concerned as time goes on that this room there'll be fewer and fewer people as the decades go by. Yeah. I'm wondering if you can address that as well.
I agree with you, and it concerns me tremendously. It's interesting because the outreach to people of your age has been so effective on the right. When I debate right-wingers, and it's one of my radio stations and one of their radio stations, the average age of people in my audience is 50s, 60s, 70s. The average age of people in their audiences is 20s, 30s, 40s. And it's because they've grown up on a diet of Rush Limbaugh. They've grown up, they don't remember the world before Ronald Reagan. And there's a lot of wisdom in this audience that's going to go when you know, decades from now, and that's a real concern. We have to be reaching out to young people. The good news is that increasingly, and I'm guessing probably not so much tonight simply because of the weather and because of what's going on and because it's May Day, increasingly at gigs like this, I'm seeing people in their 20s show up. I'm seeing teenagers show up. So we've got a new generation coming up that are progressive. And you know, the rest of us, I'm 63, the rest of us who are older need to be reaching out as wise elders and saying, we will be here for you. We learn from our experience. But there was this very activist generation you know, who was confronted by the equivalent of a crash crisis, which was called the Vietnam War. And then we had this long period of what seemed like, everything's cool, let's go make some money. And so you've got people your age, more or less, plus or minus 10 years, who just spent their lives trying to make a living. And then now you've got another generation that's facing a crisis, $1 trillion student debt crisis, people basically under 30. And they're starting to get seriously pissed off. And they're figuring out that they've been screwed. And so they're getting together with the people who were fighting back against the Vietnam War. And it's a very interesting intergenerational thing. And it plays out very interestingly in like demographics of talk radio and media. And there's just layers of interesting weirdness to it. But I don't know what to do about it other than just acknowledge it. Thanks.
Get your kids and your grandkids out here.
There you go. Well said. Aha. You don't look like you're 70 years old.
No, I'm 18, by the way, so.
Cool. Good on you.
So you've been speaking of, I'll step back from that. You've been speaking of a bubble economy. I was wondering if you think our Keynesian stimulus efforts have any merit in our current circumstances?
Yeah.
And why?
Well, we went from losing 700,000 jobs a month to gaining over 100,000 jobs a month with roughly a $400 billion stimulus. And had it been 3 times that, I think we could have gotten out of the hole. Problem is, as I note in the book, our economic systems are still broken. People say, well, you know, look at FDR. He went from 35–40% unemployment in 32. By the time World War I started, you know, I mean, he got it. He cut it in half in the first 3 years of his administration, which was amazing. And then in 37, he dialed back, and it started getting bad again. And then by the time we got into World War I, it was down to what, 12%, I think, something like that, 11 or 12%. But they still say, oh, it still wasn't. And World War I took it to 0 functionally. Well, World War II, thank you. World War II was the biggest government spending program ever. So if you want proof that government stimulus programs work, just look at World War II. I mean, it's a god-awful way to do it, and Reagan did the same thing. He borrowed $3 trillion, he spent $1 trillion of it on Star Wars, and boom, you know, the economy popped as a result of it. George W. Bush did the same thing. He spent over $2 trillion on 2 wars. If he hadn't had those 2 wars, that recession that we had in 2000 would have been the Great Depression of the whole decade. So yeah, it does. When money is cheap, government should be borrowing and spending. When money is expensive, and the economy is going well, governments should be paying down the debt and backing off. There's a cycle, a natural and healthy cycle to this. If you want the expert on this, it's Stephanie Kelton. She was on my program a couple days ago. She's one of the leaders of the modern monetary theory group. If you just Google modern monetary theory, she runs a blog called neweconomicperspectives.org that's brilliant, just brilliant.
Thank you.
So, ma'am.
There is a growing movement among universities and other institutions to divest themselves of oil stocks and other fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Do you think this can make a genuine difference in our movement toward greener energy?
Yeah, I do. Every little bit helps. Every little bit helps. I think the divestment movement is a good one. Anything that rallies people around, anything that gets people out in the streets, anything that turns people into activists, I'm in favor of. So, yes. Yes, sir. Last question.
Oh? Okay, thank you. I was just waiting to go across the room. I was told I couldn't ask my question. So my question hasn't been asked yet, and I was just wondering how everything we've been talking about, I think, has a large part in the fact that we don't get our voices heard on the media. I mean,
we don't get our, I'm sorry?
We don't get our voices heard on the media.
Yes.
On the media that's on everywhere, the radio and the TV. And since we stopped enforcing antitrust laws and now we're about to lose the internet, what can we do to get our voices heard on the media?
Here's the sequence that I see. You raise a really good point. I've talked about this on the air a number of times. Bernie and I talk about it a lot. He's one of the few guys in Congress who actually gets it, him and Bob Menendez and Debbie Stabenow. if we got money out of politics, people say, well, you know, if you pass the 28th Amendment and you say that money is not protected by the First Amendment and corporations are not protected by the 14th Amendment, that doesn't do anything. That's true. There would be no instant consequence. But I can tell you that the members of the House and Senate, the Republicans that I know and that I interact, I live in DC, I do a political show, I don't know very many of them well, but I know a lot of them. In a heartbeat, they would love to get rid of having to spend 6 hours a day begging for money, Republicans and Democrats. So the legislation, and this is why McCain-Feingold passed with huge bipartisan support, which was rolled over by the Supreme Court, by Citizens United. So when the Republicans get the money out of politics, then they're no longer beholden to the big corporations, and they're no longer beholden to the rich people. When they're no longer beholden to the big corporations and to the rich people, then they start enforcing laws that are actually on the books right now, like the Sherman Antitrust Act. And they start breaking some of these large monopolies up, because these large monopolies are not good for our economy, they're not good for our body politic. So I don't think I'm being Pollyanna-ish to think that if we can pull this core cancer out, it's not, I mean, we can call it a cancer, it's more like the planet that's distorting the entire solar system or whatever. I mean, there's some metaphor for it, but it's this huge distorting factor of billionaire and corporate money. Get that out, then the rational things like, hey, let's localize our media again. I mean, you had a town in Utah a couple of years ago where they had a chlorine spill of a train car going through. There's 5 radio stations in this town. Not a single one had a live human being in the radio station. They couldn't warn people to evacuate their houses. This is nuts, right? And so, I mean, from a public policy point of view, from a safety point of view, from a national security point of view, from an economic point of view, and from a political point of view, it makes no sense for us to have the kind of media consolidation that we have right now. And you can track it all back, you can track it all back to Reagan dancing the dance that his big donors were doing. And we get money out of politics. I think that's the next step.
Thom Hartmann will be signing books to your right here at the table. Please join me in thanking Thom Hartmann for being here at Town Hall.